You've cried before. Not from cutting an onion, not from dust in your eye, but the real kind. The kind that comes from grief or relief, or watching someone you love walk through a door after a long time away. Your chest tightened, your throat closed, and then water came out of your eyes for no mechanical reason at all. No other animal on Earth does this. Dogs whimper. Elephants trumpet in distress. Chimpanzees scream and thrash when they grieve. But nothing else cries, not the way you do. Why would evolution give one single species on this entire planet a behavior that does nothing but announce, in the most visible way possible, that you are vulnerable? Let's get the biology out of the way first, because there are actually 3 different kinds of tears, and only one of them is mysterious. Your eyes constantly produce basal tears, a thin protective film that keeps your cornea from drying out. You also produce reflex tears, the kind that flood out when you chop an onion or get hit with smoke or wind. Both of these exist in nearly every land mammal. They're plumbing, they're maintenance. The third kind is different. Emotional tears, the ones triggered by grief, joy, frustration, or being moved by something, are found, as far as researchers have been able to document, in humans and humans alone. A biochemist named William Frey at the University of Minnesota ran one of the first detailed studies on this in the 1980s, and he found something genuinely strange. Emotional tears are chemically different from reflex tears. They contain higher concentrations of stress hormones, including a protein called prolactin and the hormone ACTH, almost as if crying is functioning as a kind of release valve, physically removing stress chemicals from your bloodstream through your eyes. Frey's research suggested that emotional crying might not just be a symptom of stress. It might be your body's way of actively processing it. So why would a species evolve a built-in, highly visible, very hard to fake distress signal? Here's where it gets interesting, because the leading theory isn't really about your eyes at all. It's about your eyebrows and your face, and the fact that humans are unusually bad at hiding what we feel. A researcher named Oren Hassan at Tel Aviv University proposed what's now called the honest signaling theory of emotional tears. The idea is this. Tears are extremely difficult to fake convincingly. Your body language can lie. Your voice can be controlled. But the moment real tears appear, they're an almost impossible to forge proof that something genuine is happening internally. And crucially, tears also blur your vision. They make you, in that exact moment, more vulnerable, less able to see a threat coming, less able to defend yourself. Hassan's theory is that this vulnerability is the entire point. By crying, you're sending a costly signal, one that says, I am genuinely distressed enough to compromise my own ability to protect myself in front of you. Animals can fake a lot of things. They can fake aggression, fake submission, fake confidence. It's evolutionarily much harder to fake a signal that costs you something real to produce. And here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. Tears don't just signal vulnerability outward. They appear to physically change how other people perceive your face. Researchers led by psychologist Robert Pravin at the University of Maryland ran an experiment using digitally altered photographs, identical faces, identical expressions, with tears either present or digitally removed. Participants consistently rated the faces with visible tears as sadder, more in need of support, and more trustworthy than the exact same face with the tears erased. The tears themselves were doing communicative work that the rest of the facial expression alone couldn't accomplish. In other words, your brain doesn't just read tears as evidence of sadness. It reads tears as a request, an unconscious social signal asking the people around you to soften, to approach, to help rather than challenge. This connects to something called the social bonding hypothesis, and it might be the deepest reason crying evolved at all. Human infants are born almost entirely helpless, far more helpless and for far longer than the offspring of almost any other species. A newborn human can't walk, can't feed itself, can't regulate its own body temperature effectively, and won't be able to survive independently for years. For a creature that vulnerable, having a reliable, unmistakable signal that immediately summons caregiving attention isn't just useful. It's a matter of survival. Infant crying triggers an almost involuntary physiological response in adults nearby, measurable increases in heart rate, attention, and motivation to intervene. Researchers studying this response have found it activates some of the same neural circuitry involved in pain perception, as though your brain processes a crying infant nearby as something close to an emergency. Some researchers, including developmental psychologist Advin Gerhowitz, who has spent much of his career studying crying, argue that adult emotional tears likely evolved as an extension of this exact infant distress system, repurposed across a lifetime to maintain social bonds, signal trust, and request support from a group long after we outgrow literal helplessness. Here's where the story gets a layer more complicated, because crying isn't uniform across all humans, and that variation tells you something important too. Vingerhowitz and other researchers have documented significant cultural and individual differences in how often, how publicly, and under what circumstances people cry. In some cultures, public emotional crying is encouraged and even ritualized, present at funerals, weddings, and reunions as an expected, almost performative display of belonging. In others, crying carries more stigma, particularly tied to ideas about gender and self-control, with men in many Western cultures reporting significantly less frequent and less public crying than women, despite similar internal emotional experiences. This doesn't mean the biological system is different between groups. It means the social rules governing when that signal is allowed to be sent vary enormously. The hardware is shared. The permission to use it is not, and that gap between what your body is built to do and what your culture allows you to show is itself a strange and very human kind of tension. There's also something worth sitting with about happy tears, specifically because crying from joy seems on the surface to contradict everything about a distress signal theory. Why would you cry at a wedding or when something wonderful and overwhelming happens? Researchers, including psychologist Oriana Aragon at Clemson University, have studied what's sometimes called dimorphous expression, the tendency for very intense positive emotions to borrow the exact same physical outlets normally reserved for negative ones. Aragon's research found that people who cried at extremely positive moments tended to recover their emotional equilibrium faster afterward than those who didn't, suggesting these tears might serve a regulatory function, helping an overwhelmed nervous system come back down from an emotional peak, regardless of whether that peak was devastating or wonderful. Your body, in other words, doesn't appear to have entirely separate machinery for overwhelming joy and overwhelming grief. It has one intensity regulation system, and tears are one of the tools it reaches for whenever that intensity threatens to become too much to hold quietly. So when you think about the last time you cried, really cried, not from an onion, but from something that mattered, you're looking at one of the strangest and most specifically human inheritances you have. A signal too costly to fake, a vulnerability too visible to hide. A request for connection your body sends out before your conscious mind has even decided to ask for help. No other species on this planet does this. Not because no other species feels grief or joy, but because none of them evolved in quite the same way you did. Dependent for so long, bonded so deeply and built around the radical idea that showing your weakest moment to someone else might be the very thing that keeps you alive. You've cried before, and every single time, without knowing it, you were running one of the oldest and most quietly sophisticated systems your species has ever built.